We are pleased that we have a guest speaker, and we've been asking for someone to talk to us on this topic. I'm pleased to introduce Steve Mister. He is today's guest speaker, and Steve has an extensive career at the intersection of both health policy, law, and consumer access, and he's seen it from every seat at the table. He worked on Capitol Hill in the office of Senators Charles Mathias of Maryland, then practiced law in Washington, D.C. He spent more than a decade at the Consumer Healthcare Products Association, the trade association for the over-the-counter medicines, rising to vice president and associate general counsel. And he also directed governmental affairs for the National Association of Professional Employer Organizations before being tapped to lead the Council for Responsible Nutrition, or CRN. Since 2005, Steve has served as president and CEO of the Council for Responsible Nutrition, leading the trade association for the dietary supplement and functional food industry, where he has built a reputation for balancing advocacy with accountability, championing industry transparency, and defending consumer access to health products. Steve holds a Juris Doctorate, a master's in political communication, and a bachelor's in speech communication, and is a certified association executive. Today, he joins us to share his perspective on health savings accounts and flexible spending accounts, followed by a Q&A style discussion. Please join me in welcoming Steve. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you for that very kind introduction, although I think it had the unintended effect of making me feel very old all of a sudden when you recited all of those things. All right. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. And so I'm going to jump right in. You all have asked me to talk about the inclusion of supplements in flexible spending accounts and healthcare savings accounts. And it is our number one legislative priority right now at CRN. So we certainly have lots to say about it. I was mentioning we had our annual fly-in day earlier this week where we brought about 60 of our executives to DC for meetings on Capitol Hill, and it was our number one issue that we talked about. So certainly very timely for us. Okay, so just to do a little level setting, this may be review, but just make sure that we're all on the same page. What are FSAs, HSAs, and even HRAs? So these are very different kinds of accounts, but they are similar in that they are all accounts that are set up usually by an employer for its employees that allow people to put pre-tax money in the account and then use that money to purchase certain medical expenses. The flex spending accounts are the most common. A lot of employers offer those. The big thing about those is that they are use it or lose it every year. So people divert a little bit of their payroll savings or the payroll into these savings accounts pre-tax. They use the money pre-tax, so it makes the money go further. But if they don't use it at the end of the year, it forfeits back to their employer. Health savings accounts are usually held for people who have high deductible health care plans, and it allows them to put significant sums away to use in lieu of having more expansive health care coverage under their plans. And that allows them to roll that money over year to year and actually to invest it so that they can have long-term savings for a catastrophic illness or something in the future. HRAs are the least common, but it is, again, another employer-funded benefit. So that's what we're really talking about. All three of these issues relate back to the same provision of the IRS code as to what can you use, what can you buy with that money. And it is a qualified medical expense is the term that's used. That's what you can use your FSA, HSA, HRA for. And the IRS code defines a qualified medical expense as the cost of diagnosis, cure, mitigation, or treatment or prevention of disease, or the purpose or affecting the structure and function of the body, And it can include services to various healthcare practitioners, as well as equipment, supplies, diagnostic devices, etc. And as you probably know, if you have one, and a lot of people do have them, they have expanded over the years now. So, you can buy sunscreens because sunscreens are considered over-the-counter medicines. You can buy sunscreens out of those accounts. You can buy a scale for your bathroom so you can weigh yourself once a week. Orthodontics and mouth guards and such are covered. Massage guns or the Theragun is covered. You can get your 23andMe diagnostics covered through your HSAs, all kinds of things. But the interesting thing is that because of a statement from the IRS commissioner back in 2002, you cannot use these accounts for dietary supplements. And the commissioner said, that medical expenses are things that actually treat or prevent a disability or illness. They do not include things that are merely beneficial for general health. And then he went so far as to say, such as vitamins or a vacation, which really got under our skin because we want to be really clear. Vitamins are not the same as vacations. Vacations are nice for your general well-being, but they certainly do not have the same effect on health that daily use of vitamins, minerals, and other kinds of supplements do. So, that was sort of like the salt on the wound for us. Since then, the IRS has doubled down on this position several times. So, for instance, what you're looking at now is an IRS guidance, and it says, can you use nutritional supplements as a medical expense? And in that case, the IRS said, well, only if they are recommended by a medical professional. And so what that means is that for the general purpose of a dietary supplement, you cannot use FSA, HSA money for them. However, if you go to your doctor and you can get your doctor to write something for you called a letter of medical necessity, you can then go buy that supplement at your local, drugstore and then submit the receipt along with the letter of medical necessity from your doctor to whoever the administrator of your plan is, and they will reimburse your supplement. But you can imagine that is a real headache for doctors. And in fact, when we have tried to survey some medical professionals, the vast majority of them do not even know that that is an option to use these letters of medical necessity. The other thing that has happened is that there are some companies that have sprung up that will generate letters of medical necessity for you without even having a real doctor visit. And while that is certainly helpful to consumers who are looking to stretch their dollars, the IRS has previously said that those are not technically legal because there is no actual visit with a healthcare professional. So there was not any kind of intervention that determined that the person needed this for a medical purpose. And so that's the world that we find ourselves in now as the dietary supplement industry, is that there are certain workarounds, people, try to do things, but as a general rule, supplements are not included. So we're trying to address that. And the best way to do that is through legislation, to just get it codified into the IRS code that dietary supplements are a recognized qualified medical expense. And there are currently two bills on Capitol Hill, one in the House, one in the Senate, that would do that. The Senate bill is co-sponsored by two Republicans, Senator Kramer and Senator Curtis. But the House bill is actually bipartisan, which is, what we always hope for, is that you can argue that this is something that spans both sides of the political aisle. And so we have representatives, both Democrats and Republicans, on the House bill. They are very, very similar, not identical, but very similar. One of those bills, I think it's the House bill, has an annual cap on what can be included. So basically, it allows the coverage of dietary supplements, but I believe it's only up to a certain threshold that you can spend per year out of those pre-tax accounts. But we're also pursuing a two-track policy right now because remember, the reason that we're not considered medical expenses is because the IRS commissioner determined that 20 years ago. So the IRS could also make this change by simply changing its revenue ruling and allowing supplements to be classified as a medical expense. But historically, the IRS has been reluctant to do this by regulation, but they certainly could do it without any action of Congress if they wanted to. And so our dual approach has been to both, lobby in favor of the legislation on Capitol Hill, but at the same time to have a series of communications with the Treasury Department and the IRS to see if we can't get them to do it by regulation instead. And in fact, recently, the co-sponsors of the legislation in Congress wrote to Congress with I think about 10 or 11 other members, or they wrote to Treasury asking Treasury to do this by regulation, in which case they wouldn't need their bills. But we have not heard back from that either. So at this point, I thought I'd kind of shift gears and tell you, where are we seeing obstacles? What's the opposition to this? And it really varies. So from the Republican side, there are some very conservative Republicans who have said they won't support our bill, not because they don't like supplements, but because they have these general concerns about any kind of legislation that would add to the deficit. And their concern is that if we have more things included in HSAs and FSAs, more taxpayers will put more pre-tax money into these accounts, and that would, increase the deficit. And I'm going to address that in a minute. On the other side of the aisle, we have some progressive Democrats who have opposed this, again, not because of supplements, but because of HSAs and FSAs generally. There is we think, misinformation among many Democrats that HSAs and FSAs are really created to be tax avoidance vehicles for rich people, and that the only people who use these programs are wealthy people who are looking to put money aside pre-tax and then invest it. And of course, the Democrats are very protective of the Affordable Care Act that was passed under President Obama, and they're very concerned about anything that might undercut health insurance and having as much health insurance for all as they can. And then the third thing that I would say that sometimes bubbles up in these conversations is just a general mistrust of dietary supplements. And there are members on Capitol Hill who, still believe that we are an unregulated industry. And so we have to start the conversation by educating them on the fact that we are a regulated industry and that, these are not just snake oil. So those are kind of the three buckets of where we get opposition. So the first one, well, how much would it cost? So, we've done a lot of the research around this. And remember that if people put pre-tax money away and use it for whatever they're buying out of their HSAs and FSAs, the Treasury is not losing the full value of that investment. What the Treasury loses is the tax that they would have collected. So, for instance, in this example, if you had somebody who was in the 25% tax bracket and they put $3,000 into their FSA this year, the government is losing $750 in taxes. They're not losing the full $3,000. But then the question is, okay, if people have FSAs and HSAs anyway, is the inclusion of supplements going to change their behavior? If they have these programs and they're putting the money away for co-pays and non-prescription drugs and eyeglasses and things like that. So, oh, by the way, I've shared these slides with Michael, so he will share them with you afterwards if you want them. So there's kind of two important points here. One is, if supplements are included, will more people suddenly rush out and create FSAs and HSAs to get the benefit. So that's one way it could impact the Treasury. And the other one is if people who are not currently maxing out on how much they can put into these programs suddenly decide that, they're going to put another $1,000 in to their FSAs in order to go out and buy supplements. The Treasury could lose money from that perspective. So, we've done a lot of research around the motivations for HSAs and FSAs. And what we have found is that taxpayers do not make decisions about whether or not to have an FSA or how much they're going to put in based on what specific items they can use the money for. People are not sitting there going, oh, now I can use it for my eyeglasses. I'm going to put an extra $300 in there so I can buy, Louis Vuitton frames. What the data shows is that taxpayers determine how much they put into their FSAs and HSAs within the annual limits based on how much they can afford to have taken out of their take-home pay. Because remember, if you say I'm going to put $1,200 into my FSA this year, that means every month your paycheck is going to be $100 less because you've diverted that money pre-tax. And so that becomes the really determinant factor for consumers. So this notion that people are suddenly going to put a lot of more money into their FSA because they can buy feminine hygiene products just doesn't follow the data. So for instance, if you look at FSA contribution levels over the last 10 years, they have been relatively flat, despite the fact that during that time, eyeglasses have been added, over-the-counter medicine has been added, feminine hygiene products has been added, all these things, Theraguns has been recognized as an optional expense. And despite that, the amount of money people are putting away has really been tied much more to, their rates of inflation or their increases in pay. The same is true of HSAs. When you look at HSAs and you look at how much people are putting into those, that too has been relatively flat. And I've singled out over-the-counter medicine because a lot of times we're compared to those. And they've had a rather tortured history. And as Terry mentioned, I was in the over-the-counter medicine association until 2005. So I was there when OTCs were first recognized by the IRS. So they weren't eligible. Then they were eligible starting in 2003. When the Affordable Care Act was passed in 2010, Congress took them out. And then in 2020, during the pandemic, the CARES Act passed and they restored contributions for OTCs. And yet through all of that, the amount that people were putting away was basically flat. So these changes about whether OTCs were in or out were having no effect on consumer behavior. We also wanted to know, well, how much are consumers spending on these products? We do a consumer survey, and our data shows that consumers spend about $360 a year on supplements. And so, one of the versions of the legislation I mentioned would cap eligible purchases at $250 per person. And we don't love that, but we don't think that would be a negative. And if that's what it takes to get us into the program as a starting point, we're willing to live with that cap. So then we move to the second argument, which is these are just vehicles for the rich. And this is a really easy one to shoot down because when you look at who has healthcare savings accounts or HSAs and FSAs, you can see that the vast majority of these people are people with incomes under $100,000. I mean, they are using them to offset medical expenses that they might not otherwise be able to pay for. So the misnomer that some of the progressives have that these are just tax vehicles for the rich is simply not borne out by the data. And then we went and we asked consumers, well, what do you want? And what we found out was that 78% of people who already have HSAs and FSAs say they would like to have the flexibility to use them to purchase their supplements, and that they would include those supplement purchases in their FSAs. But when we said, okay, well, would you put any more? And I'm not just talking about like $100, but would you even put another $25 a year in there? And 66% of the people said, nope, we're going to make our decision based on something else. But just because we can buy our multivitamins out of these accounts, we're not going to change how much we put away. So, I'll shift gears a little bit now to talk about why we're doing this. Why does this really matter to us? I mean, this is not going to suddenly double the size of the supplement industry. We're not doing this because we think we're going to sell twice as many multivitamins by doing it. We're doing it because we think getting dietary supplements recognized as a medical expense will give more consumers access to the products. It will make people's dollars go farther and allow them to buy more supplements. And it will create parity with all these other things that have been allowed into the accounts over the last 10 years that are now considered medical expenses, and yet we're on the outside looking in. We think it gives us kind of an official government recognition that supplements do play a role in healthcare and that they are a medical expense just like many of these other products. And we think it then gives consumers, if consumers see that they can buy these products with their FSAs and HSAs, it instills more confidence in them that these are actually things that promote better wellness. So it's certainly not a get rich quick scheme for the supplement industry. And then the last piece that I'll talk about is that in addition to the fact that it's not going to cost the Treasury any more money, we believe that these products actually will reduce healthcare cost overall. And when you think about the fact that the government is the largest payer of healthcare between Medicaid, Medicare, and VA benefits, if we can bring down healthcare cost, the government actually saves money because they are now not paying for these expenses. And so we did an economic study back in 2023 called Supplements to Savings, where we looked at 9 different supplement regimens. We factored in what it would cost to supplement that portion of the population, and then looked at how much that particular disease cost the country today. So for instance, if you look at about halfway down, calcium and vitamin D helps to prevent osteoporosis. There's very clear data that using calcium and vitamin D reduces your risk of osteoporosis and thereby lowers the frequency of falls and fractures that are attributable to osteoporosis. If you look at what falls and fractures cost this country from emergency room visits, and I speak from personal experience because 3 weeks ago, my 91-year-old mother fell and broke her hip. If you look at what that cost and then look at what it would cost to supplement those folks over 20 years with calcium and vitamin D, we could save over a 10-year period $155 billion simply by making sure that postmenopausal women were getting sufficient levels of calcium and vitamin D. And those numbers, as you can see, cross a whole list of diseases. So there is the added benefit that not only would we make the products more accessible, but we might actually lower healthcare costs. And this is an infographic from the study, if anybody wants to dig into it a little bit more, as to what we found in terms of healthcare cost savings. So I'll wrap up by saying, well, what can the Integrative Health Policy Consortium do if this is something that's interesting to you? Well, you can express support for the Senate bill, S4587, through your lobbyists, through letters to members, encouraging your own members of Congress to either co-sponsor or support the bill. You can do the same thing on the House side with H.R. 8933, or you can communicate with the Treasury Secretary. We think Secretary Kennedy also, even though this is an IRS issue, we think he plays an outsized voice within the administration. And if he were to talk about this in a cabinet meeting, it would certainly get attention from Secretary Bessent and others. Or going directly to the Undersecretary for Tax Policy and asking the IRS to revise its revenue ruling, which is that other course that I talked about early on. So I think I've stayed within my 30 minutes, but that is a whirlwind tour of what we're doing around HSAs and FSAs. And I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Steve. That was very comprehensive. Thank you very much for the background and the avenues and the definitions. Does anyone on the committee have a question for Steve?
I do.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I
Deb.
don't see all the videos, but hi, Steve. I'm Diana Crumrine. I'm with the American Association of Naturopathic Physicians. Luke Huber is on our board. So thank you so much for being here. I was curious, you mentioned the specific bills that have this action, but I'm also curious if CRN has thoughts on the Great American Healthcare Plan and that piece of addressing HSAs, FSAs.
Yeah, we have not taken a view on some of these broader things. There are a number of bills on the Hill that would include a lot more kinds of preventative programs in them. One is gym memberships and things like that. And we've decided that we're going to keep our attention very narrowly focused on just these two bills. That doesn't mean that we don't agree that other things should be in the programs, but if we have our name on too many bills, it dilutes the focus on supplements.
Thank you.
Beth, did you have a question?
I just thank you for coming on and doing this. This was incredibly helpful. And it highlights that the opportunity, legislation it will resolve the issue, but it's not required. And I do think that the path of having the two secretaries talk is your most effective route. And I think that maybe IHPC could reinforce that by sending a letter to the Secretary of Health endorsing that activity, the communication, because this affects every healthcare professional out there is making recommendations on how to be healthier. Supplements are obviously, when you talk about vitamin D and other things, that there's nationwide, depletion within the population. It's a no nonsense, it makes perfect sense. It fits within the MAHA structure. And I would actually make a motion, Terry, for us to make a recommendation to the board for IHPC to send a letter to support this to Secretary Kennedy. So.
This is Margaret. I second that motion. This is so very important. And thank you, Steve. It's great to see you.
Sure. And Beth, good to see you. It's been a while.
It's good to see you as well. It has been. I'm glad you're still with CRN. So, is there anything else on CRN's platform right now that we should know about?
The other thing that I would just mention, and I'm not sure that you want to take a position on this, but we have been very strongly in support of a dietary supplement registry. And I think it has gotten a bad rap from some people who are putting out misinformation about it. So if I could just take, 30 seconds to explain what it is that the proposal would do. I want to be very clear. We are not supporting anything that would give FDA pre-market approval over dietary supplements. I mean, that was a fundamental tenet of DSHEA 32 years ago, and our position has not changed on that. The problem is that, FDA does have other tools that it can use. There's supposed to be facility registration. We're required to have a supplement fax box on our labels. There are restrictions on the kinds of claims we can make. There's adverse event reporting that's required for these products. But all of these other tools are kind of predicated on the notion that FDA can find you and that they know what's in the marketplace. And that was the one thing that we kind of didn't think about when we passed DSHEA 32 years ago, which is how does FDA keep up with what is now a $68 billion industry? The registry would require that when a company brings a dietary supplement to market, that they give FDA a copy of the label, period. They do not have to give FDA information beyond what's on the label. FDA does not have a chance to hold up the launch of the product. FDA does not have a chance to review the label and make changes. And the legislation is very clear that FDA cannot use it for pre-market review, and that once the label is submitted to FDA, the process is complete. Senator Durbin is the primary sponsor of a Senate bill. There is now a House companion bill on this issue from Congresswoman Dexter. But, we've encountered some opposition from some of the consumer side of the natural health movement because they've been told that this is a version of pre-market approval for these products. It absolutely is not. We have a whole section of our webpage devoted to the background information. And if you follow me on LinkedIn, most recently you've seen that we have launched a superhero called Sergeant Searchlight, who is a cartoon superhero who is trying to, shine the light of transparency on the supplement industry through the registry. And really, that's what this is about. It is about giving FDA a way to hold companies accountable by knowing that they're there. And the last thing I would say is, if we are successful in passing this, FDA really doesn't have to even enforce it, although we hope they will, because the retailers and doctors are saying, we'd like a way to know who we should keep off our platforms. Who should we keep off our store shelves? And our feeling is that if a company is not willing to put its label in the registry, then they probably should not be for sale on Amazon. And so if we have a mandatory registry for products, retailers, whether it's Amazon or Walmart or even a healthcare practitioner who's selling products out of their office, if they're not in the registry, they can say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to sell your product because it's misbranded. So that's my soapbox on the registry. And again, if you want to follow up with me, we'd be happy to give you more information on that.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah.
Okay, so, Michelle?
Hi, yeah, thanks so much for being here. Steve, I really appreciate your presentation. I'm totally in support of the motion on the table. Absolutely, I think it's important. I have a couple questions. One is, I'm wondering if it's gone through, or these bills that you shared with us have gone through the Congressional Budget Office scoring process, and if that was a positive experience or not. And the last thing I'll just say is, I know that I completely understand why you're not necessarily supporting all of the different irons in the fire right now for HSAs legislatively, but I will say the Great American Health Alliance, one thing that is beneficial, and I think AHPC folks should know about, is it does support money for individuals to pay for licensed complementary integrative health provider visits, which I think is distinct and unique. So outside of insurance, those people can actually pay for visits with those people that are licensed in their states. So I think that's a unique provision. So I'll just say that, but I'm curious about CBO.
Yeah, and again, it's not that we don't agree with a lot of the other pieces of the Great American Health Plan, but for our mission is, we are only supplements. And so that's why we're only taking a public position on those things that specifically address supplements. On the scoring issue, it has been a bad experience for us. The legislation was submitted to the Joint Committee on Taxation. They came back with an astronomical number over 10 years. They said it would add something like $49 billion to the deficit. We pushed back on that and said, how do you get to a number that is that big, given the fact that the industry is, not even that big? We're talking about only the taxable portion of what's being put away, not the full amount that people are. Again, the arguments that I went through in my presentation. And the Joint Committee on Taxation has refused to show us its work, which makes us think that there's something going on within JCT, that they have been motivated to score this very high so that it looks a lot more expensive than it is. We've talked about this with our bill sponsors. They agree with us that the number is simply out of whack, which is another reason why we might just want to try to get IRS to do it, because the IRS doesn't have to rely on the congressional JCT. Members of Congress, if they're trying to put this into, a package of bills to pass, they have to then offset any expenses with savings somewhere else. And the JCT number is going to be real hard to offset because it is just artificially large.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. That's frustrating, I'm sure.
Honestly, we don't think that it's going to change that much consumer behavior. People are not going to run out. They're assuming in their model, as best we can tell, that with this change, millions of Americans are going to rush out and open FSAs and HSAs and then try to spend the entire $3,300 that they can put in there on supplements. And again, we know that the average spend is 1/10 of that. And we know that consumers are not making decisions based on whether they can buy sunscreens or not. So the model is flawed, but they won't share their numbers with us. They just come out of, behind the curtain and say $49 billion.
Okay. Good question, though. Okay, anyone else have a question for Steve? Steve, I want to thank you for your time and diligence in providing this presentation for us. We really appreciate it.
I'm glad to be here.
While he's still here, let's take up Beth's motion to have the Board of Directors of IHPC send a letter to the Secretary supporting the expansion of the HSAs. Do I have a second? Michelle?
Yeah.
Okay. So should we have some discussion? Okay. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed, same sign. Okay. All right. Michael, I'll write that recommendation to give to the board related to that.
Well, thank
Okay.
you all very much. Appreciate your support.
Thank you, Steve.
Good to
Thank
see
you,
you.
Steve.
Okay. Have a good weekend.
Steve.
All
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
bye.
Thank you.